Ron DeSantis walked into the CNN debate studio thinking he was about to school the governor of Texas about faith, governance, and moral leadership. The Florida governor and rising star of the conservative movement had publicly criticized Governor Greg Abbott earlier that week, questioning his priorities and suggesting that Abbott's approach to faith in public policy wasn't truly grounded in real Christian values. But what happened next would leave the 46-year-old presidential hopeful completely speechless and set off one of the most viral political moments of Abbott's career. The 67-year-old Texas Republican had been sitting quietly as DeSantis launched into his well-rehearsed moral crusade, framing himself as the ultimate defender of biblical truth and conservative principles. Abbott knew exactly what was coming. For days, conservative media had been echoing DeSantis' subtle jabs, painting Abbott as too pragmatic, too willing to compromise, and not fully committed to the moral high ground that the evangelical base expected. But Abbott had prepared something that would turn DeSantis' own talking points and even scripture against him in front of millions of viewers. The studio lights blazed as host Anderson Cooper introduced the segment on faith and politics in modern America. DeSantis sat confidently in his tailored Navy suit, the same man who had taken on Disney, overhauled Florida's education system, and positioned himself as the next major force in Republican politics. His reputation as a moral authority in conservative circles seemed unshakable, or so he thought. Across from him, Abbott adjusted his dark gray blazer, his decades of political leadership and reputation as a principled statesman, giving him the quiet confidence to face down anyone who questioned his moral compass. A lifelong Texan and devout Christian, Abbott knew his scripture well and was about to prove it in the most decisive way possible. Before we dive into how Greg Abbott used the Bible and constitutional principles to dismantle Ron DeSantis' moral high ground, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single incredible political moment like this. Trust me, you'll want to see every second of what happens next. The tension in the room was electric. Conservative viewers had tuned in expecting to see DeSantis challenge Abbott and come out on top, cementing his image as the bold, uncompromising leader of the conservative movement. Texans and Abbott supporters, on the other hand, hoped their governor could stand firm against the Florida firebrand. Nobody expected what was about to unfold, a masterclass in constitutional reasoning and biblical knowledge that would leave DeSantis scrambling and create a viral moment dominating social media for weeks. As the cameras rolled and Cooper prepared to moderate what many assumed would be a straightforward discussion on faith and governance, neither the audience nor DeSantis himself realized they were about to witness a political and rhetorical takedown carried out with precision. Abbott's phone had been buzzing all morning with messages from his staff, pastors, and longtime allies who knew he was walking into potentially hostile territory. But he had spent his weekend studying, praying, and preparing for exactly this moment. The stage was set for a showdown that would redefine how America thought about moral authority, not just in politics, but in leadership itself. What made this confrontation even more explosive was the timing. Just that morning, DeSantis had appeared on Fox and Friends, doubling down on his critique of what he saw as soft conservative leadership. These politicians want to lecture us about Christianity while compromising with forces that stand against what Christ taught, he declared, earning enthusiastic applause from the hosts. The clip had already garnered over 100,000 views and thousands of supportive comments from his loyal followers, many of whom saw DeSantis as the uncompromising standard-bearer of moral conservatism. Conservative political influencers had spent the day amplifying Ron DeSantis' message across every major social media platform. Prominent right-leaning podcasters were promoting the upcoming CNN appearance as a rare chance to watch a bold, unapologetic conservative leader publicly challenge the Texas governor on questions of moral clarity and political courage. The anticipation was so intense that CNN's live stream was already breaking viewership records before the segment even began. Meanwhile, Greg Abbott's morning had been very different. He had attended his regular Bible study at a small church near the governor's mansion, where the group happened, ironically, to be studying the Gospel of Matthew. The parallel between the lesson and his upcoming appearance wasn't lost on him. His pastor had even texted that morning, "Remember, the word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword." No one realized just how prophetic those words would soon feel. To understand why this confrontation mattered to millions of Americans watching at home, you have to know who these two figures are, and why their clash represented more than just a policy disagreement. Ron DeSantis embodies the aggressive, culture war-driven wing of modern Republican politics. Born in Jacksonville, Florida, and educated at Yale and Harvard Law, DeSantis built his career on high-profile battles against what he calls woke ideology. As governor of Florida since 2019, he has pushed legislation restricting certain school curricula, challenged corporate giants over political stances, and positioned himself as a national leader in defending conservative social values. His political brand centers on being uncompromising, disciplined, and willing to confront opponents head-on, no matter the controversy. With a large and loyal online following, DeSantis has become a central figure in the GOP's national conversation. Just 3 days before this CNN appearance, DeSantis had posted a viral thread implicitly targeting Abbott, along with other Republican leaders he viewed as too cautious. Strong leadership means standing firm on principle, not bending to political convenience, he wrote. Without naming Abbott directly, the message was clear. Certain leaders talked about defending conservative values, but weren't willing to make the hard calls. The post racked up tens of thousands of likes and shares among conservative activists who saw DeSantis as the future of the Republican Party. Influencers amplified the message, with some going further, questioning whether measured, consensus-seeking Republican leaders like Abbott were truly committed to the fight. But they had underestimated their opponent. Greg Abbott represents a different style of Republican leadership, rooted in decades of public service, Texas pragmatism, and an unshakable personal faith. Born in Wichita Falls and raised in Texas, Abbott's life was forever changed at age 26 when an accident left him paralyzed from the waist down. Rather than retreat, he launched a legal and political career, serving as Texas Attorney General before becoming governor in 2015. A devout Catholic, Abbott has consistently woven his faith into his public life, championing religious liberty, defending pro-life legislation, and pushing for policies that balance moral conviction with constitutional governance. Unlike many politicians who invoke religion only when politically advantageous, Abbott's faith journey has been public, steady, and lifelong. He has often cited scripture in speeches, grounded his policy positions in moral reasoning, and framed his governorship as a calling to serve both God and the people of Texas. This quiet but steadfast approach had earned him a deep well of trust among many Texans, something DeSantis was about to discover the hard way. When Greg Abbott first ran for governor in 2014, he didn't shy away from his conservative principles or his deep Christian faith. He spoke openly about how his understanding of Scripture shaped his views on leadership, personal responsibility, and the role of government. His campaign ads often featured him speaking from the pews of Texas churches, sharing how faith and service were inseparable in his life. Since taking office, Abbott had become known for his steady, disciplined approach to governance, balancing moral conviction with constitutional restraint. He wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy wherever he saw it, whether from Democrats pushing policies he viewed as destructive to Texas families or Republicans whose rhetoric outpaced their results. His social media following, while smaller than Ron DeSantis' massive national platform, had been growing steadily among Texans and conservatives who valued consistency over theatrics. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond two Republican governors debating on cable news. This was about who got to define moral leadership in the conservative movement. For years, figures like DeSantis had positioned themselves as the purest defenders of faith and values, often framing more pragmatic leaders like Abbott as insufficiently bold. DeSantis' attack on Abbott wasn't just political, it was personal and ideological. He was essentially arguing that Abbott's willingness to balance principle with practicality made him less of a true conservative warrior. This kind of intra-party moral purity test had been used before to discredit leaders who didn't fully embrace the culture war at maximum volume. But Abbott represented something DeSantis wasn't expecting, a seasoned leader whose faith and policy record gave him the moral credibility to fight back. To Abbott, the role of a Christian leader wasn't just to win political battles, but to govern with a steady hand, protect the vulnerable, and preserve order. DeSantis represented a newer, louder strain of conservatism, one that saw aggressive confrontation as proof of conviction. Millions of viewers were tuning in, wondering, could a conservative still be faithful to biblical values without adopting the constant combativeness of the culture war? DeSantis embodied the new guard, saying yes, but only through relentless fight, Abbott embodied the old guard, saying yes, but through principled governance. As Anderson Cooper prepared to start the discussion, both sides of the conservative divide were watching closely. Hardline culture warriors hoped to see DeSantis dominate Abbott and prove that compromise was weakness. Pragmatic conservatives hoped Abbott could show that moral authority didn't require abandoning strategic thinking. What neither side expected was that this wouldn't be a polite back and forth. It would be a direct, point-by-point dismantling of DeSantis's attacks, delivered with the same constitutional and biblical grounding that Abbott had built his career on. Anderson Cooper opened the segment with what seemed like a straightforward question, but the air in the studio was thick with anticipation. Governor DeSantis, you've been quite vocal this week about what you see as a lack of moral leadership among some of your fellow Republicans. Can you explain what you mean by that? DeSantis leaned forward, his familiar, confident smile spreading across his face, the same expression that had played well on national stages and in viral clips. This was his comfort zone, his specialty. He had spent years honing his image as the unapologetic defender of conservative values, and he wasn't about to let Greg Abbott challenge that authority. Anderson, thank you for having me, DeSantis began, his sharp, deliberate cadence immediately recognizable to millions of viewers. What I've been saying is very simple, DeSantis began, leaning forward. You can't claim to stand for conservative values and moral leadership while supporting policies that weaken the very fabric that makes America strong. And when I look at leaders, even Republican leaders, like Governor Abbott, I see someone who talks about protecting Texans, but whose actions don't always align with the uncompromising principles this movement is built on. The camera caught Abbott's reaction, a slight lift of the eyebrows, but nothing more. He had expected this line of attack and was ready. DeSantis pressed on, his voice growing sharper as he warmed to the subject. Let's be honest, policies that compromise border security, that allow big corporations to profit from Chinese investment in our farmland, that accept the left's framing on certain social issues, these aren't the marks of strong conservative governance. Where in our Constitution or in our faith are we told to embrace half measures when it comes to defending our families and communities? Where does Scripture tell us to avoid confrontation when truth is on the line? Conservative viewers at home nodded along, sharing clips on social media with captions like, "Finally, someone willing to call it out," and "DeSantis speaks for the base." The hashtag #DeSantisSpeaks began trending among Republican Twitter users, many seeing this as a moment where the Florida governor was holding even his own party accountable for what he saw as drift from principle. But DeSantis wasn't finished. Turning slightly toward Abbott, his tone became more pointed and personal. Governor Abbott can talk all he wants about protecting Texas values, but his record shows too much room for compromise with the left. He's allowed weak enforcement measures, backed corporate incentives that don't always align with conservative priorities, and signed legislation that, frankly, falls short of the bold action our times demand. These aren't the positions of a movement in its prime. They're political calculations meant to keep everyone happy, and in doing so they risk betraying the very voters who trusted him. The studio audience, carefully balanced between different viewpoints, began to murmur. Hardline conservatives nodded in agreement, while Abbott's supporters shifted uncomfortably. This was exactly the kind of intra-party challenge that could energize the GOP's populist wing, but alienate more measured conservatives. And then DeSantis's voice rose, adopting the cadence of a rally speech. What really bothers me, Anderson, is this. Too many politicians wear the conservative label when it's convenient, when it plays well at CPAC or with certain donor groups. But when it comes time to actually govern according to the principles we campaign on, they choose politics over conviction every single time. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation linger before going in for what he clearly thought would be the knockout punch. I've spent my career fighting against the cultural and political forces trying to reshape this country in their own image. I've taken on woke corporations, activist school boards, and hostile media because I believe our values aren't negotiable. What I see from the more cautious wing of the Republican Party isn't leadership. It's conservatism in name only. It's the safe parts of the message, stripped of the courage it takes to defend them. Gesturing toward Abbott, he delivered his final line in the tone of a Sunday sermon. They'll, quote, protect your freedoms all day long, but they conveniently forget that protecting freedom also requires action, risk, and sacrifice. They'll talk about defending the family, but ignore the hard fights it takes to actually win those battles in the courts, in the legislature, and in the culture itself. They want all the benefits of claiming the conservative mantle without any of the accountability that comes with actually standing firm on our principles, DeSantis declared. The hardline side of the studio audience burst into applause. On social media, clips of his speech were already being shared with captions like, "This is what real leadership looks like," and DeSantis telling it like it is. Fox News personalities were tweeting their approval, with several already hinting they'd invite him on to expand on these points. But something interesting was happening in Abbott's corner of the internet. Instead of defensive or angry pushback, many of his supporters and even some neutral conservatives were posting variations of the same message. Wait until he hears what Abbott has to say. Oh, he doesn't know what's coming. This man clearly has no idea who he's dealing with. Because while DeSantis had been delivering his polished rally-style critique, Abbott had been sitting quietly, occasionally jotting notes on a small pad. Those who knew him recognized that look, the same calm, composed expression he'd worn in high-stakes courtroom arguments as Texas Attorney General when opposing counsel thought they'd cornered him, only to discover he'd been setting a trap all along. DeSantis wrapped up his opening salvo with what he clearly believed was an unanswerable challenge. So my question for Governor Abbott is this: if you truly believe in conservative principles, if you really believe in defending the people of Texas and the moral values we claim to stand for, how do you justify supporting policies that compromise on those values? How do you look your constituents in the eye and tell them you're protecting their freedoms when you're leaving the door open for the very forces trying to erode them? He sat back in his chair with the satisfied smile of a man who believed he had just delivered a devastating blow. In his mind, he'd done exactly what his supporters were hoping for, exposed what he saw as the weakness of Abbott's brand of conservatism, and shown that you couldn't be both a true conservative fighter and a cautious deal maker. The camera panned to Abbott. For a moment, the studio was utterly silent. Viewers at home leaned forward, anticipating how he would respond to such a direct and sweeping challenge. What they saw was a man who looked completely unfazed. If anything, Abbott appeared to be suppressing a slight smile, like someone who knew he was holding the stronger hand. He set down his pen, looked directly at DeSantis, and spoke his first words of the evening. Governor DeSantis, I appreciate you sharing your perspective on leadership and principle. I truly do. But before I respond to your questions, I have one question for you. DeSantis nodded confidently, clearly expecting some mild deflection or a shift in topic. Since you've built your political career talking about constitutional principles and unwavering conviction, Abbott began, his voice calm but carrying a weight that suggested a trap was about to spring, I'm sure you'll be able to tell me, what does the Texas Constitution, Article 1, Section 1, say about the purpose of government and the responsibilities we owe to our citizens? The confident smile on DeSantis's face began to fade. Something in Abbott's tone signaled that this wasn't going to be the easy victory he had anticipated. The studio fell completely silent as Abbott's question hung in the air. For the first time since the segment began, DeSantis looked unsure. He shifted in his chair, clearly trying to decide how to answer without walking into a rhetorical ambush. Well, the Texas Constitution, DeSantis began, then paused, realizing too late he might already be stepping into Abbott's frame. That's right, Abbott interjected, his voice still calm, but now carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly where this was going. The Texas Constitution, Abbott continued, the part where it spells out the fundamental purpose of our government and the obligations it has toward its citizens. Would you like me to quote it for you, Governor DeSantis, since you seem to have forgotten the exact words? DeSantis's confident expression began to stiffen. The man who had spent the last 10 minutes lecturing about unwavering conservatism was now being put on the spot with the very founding document of the state he was criticizing. I think we both know what it says, DeSantis replied, his voice edging defensive. I don't think we do, Abbott said, calmly reaching into his folder, because if we did, this conversation would have gone very differently. Let me read it for our audience, since you brought up constitutional principle. He looked directly into the camera, speaking with the steady, deliberate cadence he had honed through years of legal argument and public service. Government is instituted for the protection, security, and benefit of the people, and it is the duty of all political power to preserve the liberties and welfare of the governed. Abbott lowered the paper slightly, eyes still locked on DeSantis. Governor, it doesn't say government exists solely to cut taxes or fight symbolic battles. It doesn't say the purpose of public office is to posture for national headlines. It says protection, security, and benefit of the people. That means making sure Texans are safe, that our economy works for all, and yes, that our most vulnerable citizens are not left behind. The more pragmatic side of the studio audience began to sense where this was heading. On social media, users familiar with the section were already typing comments like, "Oh, he's flipping this on him, and DeSantis didn't see this coming." Abbott continued, his voice now carrying the quiet authority of a prosecutor laying out an airtight case. And here's what I notice about this language. It doesn't mention corporate subsidies. It doesn't mention punishing private businesses for political disagreement. It doesn't even mention the culture war topics you've built your profile on. The criteria it lays out for legitimate governance are about protecting people, strengthening communities, and ensuring their welfare. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pen drop. Anderson Cooper, a veteran moderator who had seen plenty of tense exchanges, looked genuinely intrigued by how quickly the conversation had turned. Abbott leaned in slightly. "So let me ask you, Governor, you've spent the last 10 minutes questioning my conservative credentials because I support policies that keep our communities safe, that invest in infrastructure, that protect disaster victims, that work to ensure every Texan, whether they voted for me or not, has a chance to thrive. But according to the Texas Constitution itself, not party platforms, not campaign slogans, but the very words this state is built on, those are exactly the duties of our office." DeSantis shifted in his chair. Abbott raised his hand gently, stopping any attempt at interruption. "I'm not done. You want to talk about constitutional literacy? Let's talk about it." He turned back to the camera, speaking directly to the millions watching at home. Article 1, Section 2, all political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit. That sounds like representative accountability to me. Article 1, Section 3, all free men when they form a social compact have equal rights. That sounds like a duty to govern for all Texans, not just the ones who agree with you. Article 16, Section 1, requires every public officer to take an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of this state and of the United States. Abbott paused, letting the words hang in the air, the way Crockett had in the original exchange. "Governor, the oath doesn't say to preserve only the parts you like or to defend only the voters you're courting in the next primary. It says all." "That," Abbott said, still holding the copy of the Texas Constitution, "sounds like public safety and justice reform. And here's another one. Our state's obligation to make suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system of public free schools. That sounds like ensuring opportunity for every child, regardless of zip code. And when it comes to disaster relief, our duty to protect life and property. That sounds like caring for communities when they're at their most vulnerable." On conservative Twitter, panic was starting to creep in. Clips of Abbott's constitutional references were spreading rapidly, not just in the usual moderate circles, but among rank-and-file Republicans. Many were sharing them with captions like, "Wait, is he right about this? And I never thought about the Texas Constitution in those terms." Abbott turned back to DeSantis, who was now visibly struggling to craft a counterattack that didn't walk into the framework Abbott had just set. "Here's what I find interesting, Governor," Abbott continued, his tone rising, not with anger, but with the conviction of a man who had spent his life studying both law and governance. "You question my conservatism because I support infrastructure that keeps our communities safe, because I work with business and local governments to rebuild after hurricanes, because I sign disaster relief packages that help families get back on their feet. Yet the very Constitution you claim to defend says those are my duties, not optional, duties." The studio audience began to murmur, with some people pulling out their phones to fact-check his citations. On social media, the conversation was exploding. Abbott Constitution and Texas Bill of Rights were trending simultaneously as thousands of users reposted the passages Abbott had quoted. But Abbott had saved his sharpest point for last. "You know what the Texas Constitution never says, Governor? It never says, I was a multinational corporation and you gave me tax breaks. It never says, I was a politically connected donor and you protected my contracts. It never says, I was a corporation skirting labor laws and you looked the other way. The document you swore to uphold talks about protecting the people, not shielding the wealth of those who could help but choose not to. He leaned back slightly, his voice taking on the quiet certainty of a closing argument. And here's what really gets me. You talk endlessly about personal responsibility. But what about corporate responsibility? What about the responsibility of those with the most resources to strengthen the state that made their success possible? What about the responsibility of government to ensure that no Texan is left unprotected in the richest state, in the richest nation on earth? Because that is exactly what our Constitution was written to do, protect the welfare and security of all Texans. The pragmatic side of the audience was now on the edge of their seats. Even some of DeSantis' hardline supporters at home were shifting uncomfortably, recognizing that Abbott had boxed him into a corner, framed by the very words of Texas's founding document. Abbott paused, letting the silence draw out before delivering the knockout punch. So I have to ask you, Governor DeSantis, if fulfilling my sworn duties to protect Texans, to provide for their safety, to secure their communities, and to ensure their welfare makes me a weak conservative, what does that make someone who opposes all of those things? The question hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. DeSantis' mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The man who had spent years confidently branding himself as the guardian of conservative principle couldn't formulate a response to having his own moral authority challenged with the Constitution itself. Anderson Cooper, recognizing the kind of exchange that would dominate political coverage for days, leaned forward to give DeSantis a chance to recover. Governor DeSantis, how do you respond to Governor Abbott's interpretation of the Texas Constitution? Cooper asked. DeSantis finally found his voice, but it was noticeably weaker and more hesitant than the confident, commanding tone he'd projected just minutes earlier. Well, of course we should protect our citizens and make sure government works for the people. But that doesn't mean, the Constitution also talks about fiscal responsibility and limiting the size of government. And where, Abbott interrupted smoothly, in Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution does it say, provide protection and security, but only after checking whether the people in need meet your political test? Where does it say, preserve liberty, but only for those who agree with you politically? DeSantis shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing. You're taking that out of context. The Constitution has to be read as a whole, he protested. I agree completely, Abbott replied with a slight, knowing smile. So let's talk about the whole Constitution. He opened the binder on the desk in front of him and began. Article 3, Section 51. The legislature shall have the power to provide for the general welfare of the state. Article 16, Section 1. All public officers swear an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of this state and of the United States. Article 1, Section 3. All free men have equal rights, and no one is entitled to exclusive public privileges. Abbott looked directly at DeSantis. That sounds like equal protection under the law to me. It sounds like ensuring all Texans, rich or poor, rural or urban, have security and opportunity. It sounds like a duty to govern for everyone in the state, not just the ones who fit neatly into a campaign ad. He was on a roll now, citing the document with the precision of a lawyer and the calm authority of a governor who'd been here before. In Article 1, Section 2 says, all political power is inherent in the people. That means our power comes from them, not from the loudest voices on social media and not from out-of-state donors. Our job is to serve Texans, not to use the office as a springboard for personal political branding. On social media, the reaction was unprecedented. Had constitutional accountability was trending alongside Abbott vs. DeSantis, with not just moderates, but many conservatives admitting they'd never thought about these constitutional provisions in such practical, governance-focused terms. DeSantis made one last attempt to seize the momentum. Governor, you can quote the Constitution all you want, but you've still supported disaster relief spending, infrastructure projects, and programs that expand state involvement. That's not limited government. Abbott's response was immediate and devastating. Governor, the Texas Constitution uses the words general welfare, protection, and security repeatedly. It contains zero references to eliminating government's role in public safety, Zero clauses about refusing to prepare for emergencies. Zero provisions about ignoring vulnerable Texans. But it does make it clear that our primary duty is to protect, serve, and ensure the well-being of this state's citizens. So if we're talking about picking and choosing, who's really doing the selecting here? He leaned forward, his voice quiet but cutting. You've spent your career telling conservatives they have to choose between principle and pragmatic governance. But what if that's backwards? What if the real question is, how can someone claim to defend Texas while opposing the very constitutional duties that define its government? The studio erupted. The pragmatic side of the audience burst into sustained applause, while the hardline faction sat in stunned silence. On social media, the moment was being shared thousands of times per minute. Political commentators were already preparing special segments on the split between symbolic conservatism and constitutional governance. But in the studio, all eyes were on Ron DeSantis, the man who had walked in expecting to lecture Greg Abbott on conservative purity, now visibly struggling to reclaim his footing. DeSantis sat in his chair, speechless, his face a mix of embarrassment, frustration, and what looked suspiciously like genuine uncertainty. For the first time in his political career, the Florida governor, known for his sharp, confident comebacks, had been left completely without words by the very constitution and duties of office he claimed to champion. Anderson Cooper, realizing he had just witnessed a televised political moment destined for history, began to wrap up the segment, but the reverberations from Abbott's constitutional takedown were only just beginning. The immediate atmosphere in the studio was electric. DeSantis sat in stunned silence while Abbott maintained the same calm, composed demeanor of someone who had just executed a flawless legal strategy. Governor DeSantis, Cooper asked, offering him one final opportunity to respond. Any closing thoughts? DeSantis's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. I guess we'll have to agree to disagree on interpretation. It was a stunning fall for a political figure who had entered the segment projecting moral authority and questioning Abbott's conservative credibility. But the real explosion was happening online within minutes of the broadcast ending. #Abbott Schools DeSantis shot to the top of Twitter trends. Clips of Abbott reading directly from the Texas Constitution were being shared at a rate of thousands per minute. And it wasn't just moderate and centrist voices who were celebrating. Something unprecedented was happening in the conservative sphere itself. The first major crack came from a prominent Republican legal scholar, someone generally aligned with DeSantis's politics, who tweeted, "When someone can cite more of the state constitution in defense of serving the people than you can in defense of political theater, maybe it's time to ask which one of you is actually following your oath." The post went viral instantly, with thousands of Republicans retweeting and adding their own reflections. Many admitted they had never actually read the constitutional clauses Abbott quoted in full. Others shared sections of state and U.S. constitutional text about public welfare and equal protection that they now realized rarely featured in stump speeches. The most surprising responses came from staunch DeSantis supporters who began, albeit reluctantly, defending Abbott's points. A well-known conservative columnist wrote, "I disagree with Abbott on plenty of policy nuances. But after watching this exchange, I have to ask, why do we spend more time talking about symbolic fights than the actual constitutional responsibilities of our offices? Why aren't we grounding our debates in the oaths we swore?" The impact went far beyond social media. Within hours, political science professors, constitutional law experts, and former judges were being interviewed on cable news, weighing in on whether Abbott's interpretation was not only valid, but deeply rooted in mainstream conservative constitutionalism. Most agreed it was sound, so sound, in fact, that it reflected the foundational principles of governance before partisan showmanship became the dominant political currency. Across the country, civic groups and political forums reported massive spikes in online engagement. Young conservatives, many of whom had grown disillusioned by the emphasis on perpetual culture wars, began sharing the clips with comments like, "Finally, someone talking about the actual job of governing. This is the conservatism I thought we were defending." But perhaps the most significant shift was happening inside DeSantis's own base. The debate had forced many Republicans to confront an uncomfortable question. If the Texas Constitution, and by extension their own oaths, clearly prioritize the protection, security, and welfare of all citizens, Why had so much of the movement become fixated on symbolic fights over issues that didn't even appear in those founding documents? The next morning, conservative media attempted damage control. Several talk show hosts tried to dismiss Abbott's citations as out of context or overly broad interpretations, but their efforts were undermined by a simple, inescapable fact. Abbott had been reading directly from the plain text of the Constitution, not obscure legal theory, not partisan talking points, but the literal words their own movement claimed to uphold. When you're arguing against direct quotations from the state and U.S. constitutions, you're on extremely unstable ground. Ron DeSantis himself tried to mount a comeback on his own social media, posting, "The Constitution must be read in its entirety, not cherry-picked for political purposes." But the responses were brutal. Thousands of users replied with additional constitutional provisions and state statutes that backed Abbott's arguments, asking DeSantis to explain how fulfilling a governor's duties toward the welfare and protection of all citizens could possibly be considered cherry-picking. The long-term implications of the debate became apparent over the following week. Nonpartisan civic organizations reported spikes in membership and donations. Young conservatives began organizing study groups focused on the real functions of state government and the public service obligations spelled out in their oaths of office. Several prominent Republican strategists privately admitted they needed to reconsider how the movement had allowed culture war battles to eclipse core constitutional responsibilities. But the impact wasn't confined to conservative politics. The debate sparked a broader national conversation about who gets to claim the mantle of true constitutional conservatism in American politics. For decades, certain political figures had positioned themselves as the ultimate defenders of the Constitution while dismissing opponents as either unserious or uninformed. Abbott's performance disrupted that narrative. Political commentators across the spectrum acknowledged that Abbott had achieved something rare, using his opponent's own stated governing philosophy and oath of office to expose contradictions in their political positions. He hadn't argued that the Constitution supported progressive politics. He had argued that, by DeSantis' own publicly professed standards, the Constitution demanded a broader, more service-oriented approach to governing. The exchange also underscored a generational shift happening within conservatism itself. Younger Republicans, even those from deeply traditional backgrounds, were increasingly uneasy with a political style that prioritized symbolic fights over fulfilling the actual obligations of public office. Abbott represented a strand of leadership reclaiming the emphasis on practical governance, citizen welfare, and institutional duty. 3 weeks after the debate, DeSantis quietly deleted his original social media thread attacking Abbott's interpretation of the Constitution. He never publicly acknowledged the deletion, but the message was obvious. His position had become politically indefensible. Meanwhile, Abbott's profile rose sharply. He was invited to speak at civic forums, veterans halls, and universities across the country, delivering talks on constitutional responsibility and modern governance. His message resonated especially with younger conservatives who had felt politically homeless in a landscape where they were told they had to choose between ideological purity and pragmatic public service. The debate also had tangible electoral consequences that rippled through the 2025 race cycle. Several Republican congressional candidates suddenly faced pointed questions at town halls. How do you reconcile opposing infrastructure funding with your oath to promote the general welfare? If the Constitution obligates equal protection for all citizens, why do you support policies that single out specific groups? Some candidates began quietly moderating their rhetoric, dropping the harshest language from their stump speeches and including more references to governance duties and public welfare. Others doubled down on polarizing issues, widening a growing split within the conservative movement. The divide became so visible that prominent party elders began warning about the potential for a deep schism in the GOP between those embracing Abbott's governance-first interpretation and those clinging to the culture war-driven approach. Democratic candidates, meanwhile, found themselves in an unexpected position. For years, they had struggled to engage effectively with constitutionalist voters, often appearing dismissive of constitutional arguments. Abbott's performance offered them a roadmap, showing how to meet constitutional conservatives on their own terms. Campaign consultants reported a surge in requests for constitutional messaging training from Democratic hopefuls eager to frame policy proposals in terms of constitutional obligations. The shift was especially visible in suburban districts where college-educated voters, many of them right-leaning independents, had been drifting away from the GOP. Post-debate polling revealed that this trend was accelerating, with many respondents citing the Abbott-DeSantis exchange as a wake-up call about the gap between rhetoric and responsibility. Perhaps most significantly, the debate ignited a broader reconsideration within conservative legal and policy circles. Enrollment in constitutional law and public administration programs saw a noticeable uptick. Policy think tanks focused on governance reform reported record interest. Even some conservative law schools began offering new courses on constitutional duties and state leadership. 6 months later, a major Pew Research Center study found that the percentage of self-identified Republicans who considered fulfilling constitutional obligations to all citizens, a top priority for elected officials, had jumped by 12 points since the Abbott-DeSantis debate. The study cited the viral nature of Abbott's precise constitutional citations as a key factor in shifting attitudes. In one night, Abbott had accomplished something that decades of good government advocacy had failed to achieve. It forced many constitutional conservatives to confront the gap between their campaign rhetoric and the actual duties outlined in the documents they swore to uphold. By using their own constitutional language and interpretive framework, Abbott had created a level of cognitive dissonance that even some of DeSantis's most loyal supporters found difficult to ignore. As one lifelong Republican blogger wrote 6 months after the debate, "Greg Abbott didn't convert me to his policy positions, but he did get me back to actually reading the Constitution, both federal and state, and looking at what it really says about the responsibilities of elected officials. Turns out, a lot of those duties look a lot more like the governance priorities I used to support before I got caught up in the culture wars." The ultimate lesson of the Abbott-DeSantis confrontation wasn't about partisan advantage. It was about the power of holding leaders accountable to their own stated values and sworn obligations. Abbott had simply taken constitutional conservatives at their word when they said the Constitution was their ultimate guide, then showed them what that guide actually requires regarding the public good, equal protection, and the general welfare. In doing so, he didn't just win a debate, he ignited a governance-focused shift that continues to influence American politics to this day. That's the remarkable story of how Greg Abbott used the very principles of constitutional conservatism to leave Ron DeSantis without an effective rebuttal and spark a nationwide conversation about the real meaning of public service. If you want to see more moments like this, where politicians are held accountable to the very values they claim to uphold, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and let us know in the comments. Do you think Abbott's interpretation of constitutional duties was correct? Has this debate changed how you think about the relationship between political rhetoric and the rule of law? We read every comment and value your insights on these pivotal political moments.